In this video, I'm going to show you how I took my old 2-year-old Epax X1 3D printer with the LCD slow printing, and I turned it into one of the latest and greatest models from Epax with the upgrade kit to a 2K mono display and a new motherboard. While I'm at it, I'm going to do a flexible build plate too. Stay tuned and enjoy. Hello guys, it's Pete from MyJourneyBench.com. Today we're going to do a big project. We're going to tackle the upgrade of my Epax X1, one of the original Epax X1s that I already upgraded to the parallel light, but now I'm going to upgrade it to pretty much a model E6 mono. And I purchased the upgrade kit from Epax Direct. I'll put a link to their website in the description below. And I'm going to go over the whole process of doing the upgrade. It is a long and arduous process, so let's cover everything that comes with the kit. You'll need some tools. You'll need a 2mm Allen wrench and a 2.5mm Allen wrench. These are the mounting brackets for the parallel light. It did not come with the M6 screws, so you're probably going to go out and have to source those. I got a bunch of those at Ace. You need 4. I purchased 8 just in case. The only instructions I got were just the firmware upgrade. Unfortunately, there are no instructions that come with this, so just follow along with my upgrade process and you should be able to get through this. The firmware was kind of tricky, and I'll walk through that when I get to that point in the video. It comes with a new motherboard. This is the newest and latest motherboard. You might have to do a firmware update to it. I did do a firmware update to this, although prior to this there was a different version. I'm not sure what this little piece of plexiglass was. It came with the kit. I did not end up using this for some reason. It comes with 2 sets of tape to go over the LED screen or the monochrome screen. And we have the new upper plate for the frame, and that's going to require you to pretty much disassemble this entire printer to mount everything back onto this frame plate. Again, you'll need those M6 screws because the light kit the mounting brackets for the light kit do mount directly to that. And last but not least, we have the monochrome LED display, which replaces the LCD display, and the new motherboard and this kind of work perfectly together when I'm all done. In addition to the monochrome upgrade, I'm also going to be putting one of these magnetic build plates on my printer. Now, the X1 or the Epax printers, there's some modifications you should make when you add one of these to it, because the build plate screws that hold the build plate to allow you to adjust the level of it are not long enough, the openings, so you're going to have to make a little adjustment when you add in the stop sensor to that. We'll cover that when I get there. So the first thing I'm going to do is remove the upper hinge cover off the frame of the Epax X1. So this is pretty simple. There's just 4 screws that hold this hinge cover on. Just remove those 4 screws and put them aside, and then you can get ready to pull this right off. So with that off, now it's time to start disassembling the build plate area, and I'm going to remove the 2 screws that hold the build plate onto the frame. Pretty simple. And the next thing we'll do is start removing all the covers. So we've got the back cover, and that's got 4 screws on there, M4s that you can take off. Put those aside. Then we'll use the M4s, the 2mm Allen wrench, to remove the bottom plate. The next thing we have to do is remove the power supply for the LED or the UV lamp. Now, I've already upgraded this to the 40-watt parallel light. I did that about a year ago, and if you didn't see that video, I'll post a link to it in the description below, as well as in the upper right corner. So we're just going to remove that parallel lamp. Just be gentle with it, and it's a good time to start taking things apart. I didn't disconnect the power supply from the cables. I'm removing the original upgrade clamps that hold the lamp in. You're not going to use these, so put those aside, but keep the screws. Now it's time to start removing the motherboard, and the motherboard has a couple little standoffs, little plastic standoffs on it, so just be cautious when you're taking out that motherboard. I'm trying to film with my GoPro as well as a lamp in there because everything's black on this printer and it's kind of tough to see. Once you get the motherboard out, now it's time just to mark those little connectors. I marked them 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I just pulled them off and put them aside. And I'm going to disconnect the sensors for the lamp off the motherboard, and that's the Z-axis sensor. We'll take that and put that off. So the motor control and the sensor are now disconnected. I'm going to flip this up, and now I'm going to start removing the LCD display. I didn't have to take off the tape. I did anyway. You don't have to when you get yours. But I just peeled mine off before I started working with it, thinking that I was going to take the LCD display off of the frame. Since I'm not going to use mine, I'll just throw it in a box and keep it. Everything still works, and God forbid something happens, I have a spare. Now it's time to start taking all these little pieces off. I'm going to start with the main frame. There are 4 screws, one in each corner of the upper frame. You're going to loosen those up and take those off, and that will loosen the frame off the main body of the printer. Just take your time, be careful, and make sure you keep the screws all organized, because you will be reusing those. So this point here, the LCD is still attached, so just be careful with it because you don't want to ruin the LCD. And once you get that plate off, you can see here now it's a matter of removing all these screws that hold all the products or the parts on the upper side. So everything is pretty much screwed in from the bottom except for the motor control. So here I'm putting in the new sensor on the new plate. Now let me just pause here for a minute. Just when we look here, you can see where that sensor is. I would suggest if you're going to use a magnetic build plate that you add in a 1.5 millimeter rubber washer underneath that to raise the sensor up off the plate. And that will allow you to not have to make any modifications to your build plate frame, or your build plate frame, when you are going to go ahead and put that back on the printer. It raises the 0 sense access, or the 0 sense location, about 1.5 millimeters if you do that. So here you can see I'm just removing all the screws for the motor mount, and once I get that done I can pull off the frame and gently put that aside. I apologize for the camera. One of my batteries died, so I grabbed another camera. Did get a little smart here and grabbed a screwdriver with a 2 millimeter Allen wrench on it so that I could just use the screwdriver instead of an Allen wrench itself. Once that's loose, you can start disconnecting everything from the frame that holds the track for the build plate. There should be 2 screws that hold that track in position. Just be careful when you loosen those screws up, everything's going to want to fall apart. Gently unscrew the motor from the track and you should be able to get everything else off of that. So now it's time to start mounting everything back to the build plate. I just put the 2 screws in that stop the resin vat, and there's the track that I'm going to mount first. So I'll get these 2 screws in place and then put the track in place. Once I have them set, I can tighten up the screws and make sure that they're straight and level. Next step is to put the track back on. Make sure you've got the track in the right direction, and then we're going to remount the motor. Now it's not as important to get this perfectly aligned where it was when you took it apart, because the new motherboard is going to use its default settings to raise and lower that build plate. There's 4 screws that have to go back into the motor mount. Make sure you get those aligned correctly and then tighten them all up. Next thing to do is put the 2 brackets that hold the vat down onto the build frame, and there are 2 screws each that hold those. Get those all mounted. Again, I apologize for the focus on the camera. Once that's done, now we can work on the rest. I decided just to clean off the cover before I work on it and peel off that Made in China sticker, since I don't need to look at that every time I open up the cover. And now that it's all cleaned up, I can finish getting this mounted back onto the printer. So be very careful when you're mounting this. Obviously you don't want to cut any wires. And now I can start putting in the screws that hold this basically to the frame of the Epax printer. So this full plate just gets screwed down with these 4 screws, 1 in each corner. Get them all tightened up. I believe this was the 2.5 millimeter Allen wrench you'll need here. Now it's time to clean this up and get ready to insert the mono display, which I already did, and now I'm going to put it in the tape. So the tape's all set, and I'm just doing a test to make sure everything seats correctly. Now on to the motherboard. So the motherboard gets mounted using that same mounting bracket that held the original motherboard. You're just going to basically swap it out and get that ready for its cable connections, because that's the next step for the motherboard. Once you get the mounting bracket on with the standoffs, we'll move on to connecting everything up and getting it set inside the printer but not mounted. I want to show you where that gold ribbon, that's the monochrome display, that gets connected right on the motherboard, the same side as all the other connectors, which is different than the original motherboard. And it only goes in one way, it'll only enter the frame one way, it'll only connect to the motherboard one way, so you really can't screw it up, but just be careful with it. It is a very delicate connector, and you should use some caution when handling it. So once you get that in place, and we started connecting all the connectors to the motherboard, we're just leaving everything connected before we proceed. And here I'm just hooking up the touchpad display to the motherboard, and the little blue tape goes face down, just in case you're wondering, and it has the two little push tabs to lock it in place. Once that's locked in, you're pretty much connected. The only thing left here would be that I haven't connected would be the USB cable. Now I'm installing the monochrome, I'm installing the parallel lamp brackets. Now this is where you'll need those M6 screws. Unfortunately, the new mounting bracket has the plate that you get with the upgrade kit is tapped for M6 screws. The original was tapped for M4s. It did not come with, my kit did not come with any screws, nor did it come with any instructions. So you're just, going to have to make sure that you go out and acquire at least 4 of those screws and get ready to mount those 2 frame brackets to the underside of that frame. Once you've done that with those screws, you can move on to installing the motherboard. So you can see I've got 3 of the 4 screws in place, and I'm just going to put the 4th one in position. And those run side to side, not front to back, so just make sure that you put them and install them the correct way. The little tabs that you see should aim towards each other, so the little tabs that hold the lamp aim towards each of the frames. Just the way I have them set there. And there's the final screw, everything's mounted, and we can go on and mount the motherboard to the underside of the frame plate. There are 2 little standoffs, little plastic standoffs that are required to be used here. It doesn't get mounted. There needs to be some separation directly from the plate. And you can see there's one of the standoffs. Now I did get those standoffs originally with my parallel lamp upgrade that I purchased a year ago, and I'm just reusing them here. So now that I've got one side in, I'll put the other side in, tighten that screw up, and there you can see the monochrome display cable, that little gold cable, and how it has to run from the top frame to the other side of the motherboard. This was a little tricky getting the screw in there, but once I found the screw hole, actually it was simple just to tighten it up, and the motherboard straightened itself out. And that's that. Now I'm going to put in the last cable. This is the, I believe this is the sensor for the Z-axis 0 position. And remember I told you that if you're going to put one of those magnetic build plates on, make sure you put a 1.5 millimeter rubber washer under that, or some kind of a little plate, so that you don't have to worry about that. I should have connected this first because it would have been a whole lot easier had I done that, but I did not do that. Now it's just time to button up all the cables and plug in the USB cord, and that's next. I'll get that mounted onto the motherboard. So that little extension cable runs to the side of the Epax X1, as well as most of their printers that have side access USB mounts. And here I'm just kind of moving the cables around, getting this parallel lamp aligned with the new mounting brackets, and there are 4 screws, and if everything tightened up perfectly, you are not going to have any issues whatsoever. I did not have any issues. Everything plugged in perfectly fine, and the screws are perfectly aligned. There was no wiggling, moving, or jiggling that I had to do to get this to work right. Now it's just time for me to give this a quick turn on and make sure everything works. I made sure I moved all the wires out of the way from wherever they were stuck in. Everything is wired perfectly and set up correctly. So we're going to turn this on. We should get a test beep here. You might get 1 or 6 test beeps depending on your model. And then I'm going to go in there and just do a quick test to make sure the display works good. I'm going to look at the software first. We're working on the newer version, but it's not the newest version. On Epax's website, they tell you that if you're using this upgrade kit, to use the E6 monochrome 2K display firmware, which basically brings this to one of the most modern printers that they have. In the firmware, you can see it says not to use the E6, but on the website it says to use the E6 for the latest version. So I did download that and put it on the memory stick. You should just have 2 files there, the LCD update and the firmware update on the memory stick. And that's what I'm going to do next. Plug in my memory stick, and then we will do the firmware update. Now, depending on which version of the motherboard that you get with your upgrade kit, you may or may not have to do the LCD update. I tried it with mine anyway. It told me that it wouldn't run, which meant it had the latest version. I did go ahead and run the firmware upgrade, and that went well. You can see there it's doing the update right there. Now, one trick that they didn't say in the printer, but it does tell you on the screen itself, make sure that you hit OK, go back to the main menu, turn the printer off, and then when you turn the printer back on, the firmware version will take effect. That's very important because it's still going to run on the older firmware until you turn it off and then back on again. So just in case you have a problem where you can't get it to test right, and I did the calibration test here, if you don't get the calibration test to show up on the display, then turn the printer off, wait a couple seconds, then turn it back on. And here you can see I'm just going to run through it one more time and take the camera and show you that it worked. Which anytime I do something for the first time and it works for the first time, I'm always happy. So that worked really well, and now I can move on to the next phase. So as I stated before, I decided to buy one of these magnetic flexible build plate mounts because I like when I'm doing jewelry prints, the build plate becomes an issue, especially with the softer resin. Now there's some issues that you really need to think about, and pretty much for any resin printer. This is going to add about 1.5 millimeters of space between the bottom part of your original build plate and the new flexible build plate. And that's why I suggest putting 1.5 millimeters rubber washer on it to raise that sensor up. Now, one of the things I did notice is that most of these flexible build plates, they are stainless steel, and they do come cut with sharp edges. I decided to use some 2000 grit sandpaper, a little sandpaper pad here, to not just scuff up the build plate, but to basically take all the burrs off the sharp corners and edges so that that didn't ruin my FEP film, because if there is a sharp burr there, it might poke a little hole in there or scratch it over time and rip it, and that would allow resin to get all over your printer. So just, you know, be conscious of that. The next thing, once you get that stuck on the build plate, and here I'm just going to remove my build plate and get that taken off. You have to use the double-sided tape that comes on the back side of the magnet and make sure that it's cleaned. And I wiped mine off with a little bit of acetone and then some isopropyl alcohol, and then stuck the magnet on it. That way I knew it was going to be attached well. Then I just put the stainless steel flexible build plate on it, put it on the printer, and loosened it all up. And the result was that sensor needed to be adjusted. And this is where I discovered that if I had put the 1.5 millimeter washer back there, it would have worked fine. So I ended up doing this afterwards and then re-leveling my build plate. So just something to think about if you're ever going to use a resin printer with these flexible build plates. Your build plate may not be able to accept one of these without any modifications, because the screws on the build plate that allow it to flex up and down so you can level it, those openings, those oval openings, might not be long enough. And I did run into that with this printer, and once I made the adjustment for the sensor, everything went well, and I was able to zero it out and re-level it. And of course, once you get it all leveled, just tighten those 4 screws up, and those 4 screws will hold their form. I pretty much only align my build plate once every couple of months now. I haven't had any issues. It's going to be interesting to see what happens with the magnetic build plate, the flexible build plate on there, if I have any issues in the future. So I'm going to keep my eye on that. But again, for jewelry repairs and using the softer resins, the castable resins that I use, the flexible build plate is going to come in very handy for me. And so, of course, what's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to go throw a whole lot of resin in this thing, and you're going to go try it. You're going to go make sure that it works perfectly, and that's exactly what I did. After I made sure the firmware was updated and the build plate was all leveled up, I brought it back to my shop, filled it with resin, and downloaded some test prints to give it a shot. I wanted to see how well they would print. I'll show you this one. It is just a small little Mickey Mouse that I wanted to see if it would print. This print took about 3 hours to print, and I'm pretty sure that with the monochrome settings that Epax, I'm actually in the sheet 2 box slicer, I'm using the Epax E6 mono settings, and I could probably modify those settings for whatever resin I'm using to make it print quite faster. I did get very good results with my photon mono, or the frozen mini mono. That thing prints ridiculously fast and very, very well. So I'm hoping to get the same results with this printer. And there's the result of a 2-inch Mickey Mouse, and he's coming out of the vat now. And I'm just going to go ahead and clean that up and get that ready to cure. I know a lot of you are like me. I print just about every single day. If you're printing and cleaning just about every day, you get into a habit where you've got a whole system for cleaning out, and my process usually takes me just a couple of minutes. I start with the build plate, clean that off while the piece is in some cleaner, and I will get that all cleaned up and ready to go for the next time I'm going to print. Usually go through quite a bit of IPA when I'm doing this, and although that's a little hard to find, if you find a source that you can get it from, make sure you get as much as you can. Once the build plate's done, I'll move on to the vat. Empty the vat out and clean that all up. And here you can see Mickey Mouse came out of the isopropyl alcohol. He's looking pretty good, and I'm just removing the supports. And lo and behold, it printed very, very well. He looks pretty good. So when I went to take the pictures of this, I dropped the little guy on the floor, and my dog's hair got kind of stuck to him, so you might see a couple dog hairs stuck on his feet. But all in all, first test print off of this with some general, I'm using the Elegoo Mars skin tone resin here, and I used a setting for this 0.05 millimeter layer height and 2 seconds per layer. I think it came out pretty good. I probably could have tweaked the settings a little bit better and gotten a much better and faster print had I just tweaked it a little bit more. So guys, if you're going to upgrade your Epax X1 to a 6 mono, go ahead and do this. Really, for the price that Epax sells this for, $199 for the upgrade kit, if you already have the parallel light, it's worth it. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.